France, June 26, 1943, mid-morning. The sky is a white-hot wound over Normandy. Flak blossoms rise like black flowers around the heavy American bomber stream as a lone silver fighter breaks formation and dives out of the sun. It's a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the heaviest single-seat fighter of the war, and right now it's falling. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson fights to see through oil and blood. The canopy won't budge. The engine howls under fire. Behind him, 30 Luftwaffe fighters swarm, their gun flashes pulsing like camera bulbs in hell. Every hit rattles the armor. Every vibration screams ruin. The nose pitches down into the dive that physics, and his own instructors, warned would tear this aircraft apart. 6 tons of American metal plunge toward the channel. The altimeter spins. Rivets sing, wings bend under forces mankind barely understands. Johnson prays not for rescue but for control. Below, German pilots follow and then pull back. They know what he's doing. They know no one comes out of a dive like that. But through the howling wind and shards of sunlight, the jug begins to level. The dive that should have killed pilot and plane instead reveals what no one believed possible. That day, the impossible didn't crash. It learned to fight back in 1943. Air superiority over Europe wasn't decided by courage. It was decided by altitude, and America was losing both. Every week, U.S. Army Air Forces launched daylight raids from England's eastern coast. Hundreds of B-17 flying. Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rolling, down muddy runways to strike, factories deep inside occupied France and the Reich. Their crews called them milk runs, but everyone knew the truth. Once those bombers crossed the coast, there was nothing above them but German fighters. The Luftwaffe ruled the high air. Escort Spitfires and early P-38s simply couldn't fly far enough or high enough to shield the slow, bright targets stretching across the sky. Dozens never returned. At Allied headquarters in London, generals faced an impossible equation. Daylight precision bombing mattered, but it was suicide without protection. In the search for an answer, they turned to a new machine from Republic Aviation, an aircraft so large and unconventional, it looked more like a flying tank than a fighter. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been running test flights across Long Island fields for 2 years, gaining a reputation as experimental folly. It was nearly twice as heavy as its British and German counterparts, so complex that mechanics joked it took an act of Congress to start it. Its designers claimed it could outclimb and outdive anything in the air. Most pilots just laughed. One called it a mule trying to be a racehorse. The man behind the design was Alexander Kartveli, an immigrant engineer from Georgia. The country, not the state. Kartveli's theory was simple and radical. Put the most powerful engine imaginable in the smallest frontline frame, add armor thick enough to stop anti-aircraft rounds, and trust American industry to make it light enough to fly. The result was an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, feeding through a complex turbo supercharger that sent air from the nose all the way to the tail and back again. It was a marvel, and a maintenance nightmare. By early 1943, war planners had no time for ideal beauty. They needed muscle. They needed something that could carry a pilot through a sky ruled by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The first Thunderbolts were shipped to Britain in crates the size of cottages. At RAF airfields in Norfolk and Suffolk, American mechanics spent endless nights bolting them together under blackout lamps, swearing at the wiring diagram while wind rattled the canvas hangars. Pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, under Colonel Hub Zemke, were the first to receive them. Their first impressions weren't flattering. The jug, as the men immediately christened it, was enormous. Its wings shadowed the ground crew, its landing gear thick as ship anchor chains. When a pilot climbed aboard, the seat felt sunken, the radial engine a wall ahead of him. The long nose blocked the entire runway view. Takeoffs were acts of faith. Novices joked that you didn't fly a P-47, you negotiated with it. And yet, for all its awkwardness, a few veterans sensed potential. Zemke recognized something familiar. The aircraft behaved like its pilots, stubborn, heavy, and unyielding, but steady once momentum built. On paper, it was faster than the famous German FW-190, capable of a dive speed no opponent could match. Kartveli had even theorized it could survive its own terminal velocity. The problem was proving it before combat proved otherwise. By spring, Allied command ordered P-47s into operational testing. They escorted bomber streams to Lille, Rouen, and Saint-Omer. Radio interference plagued formations. Several Thunderbolts went down in the channel without enemy contact. Still, Zemke's men persisted. In May 1943, they claimed their first confirmed kills against German interceptors. Word spread that the Jug might just be unstoppable if you learn to let gravity fight for you instead of against you. Deep in the data logs, one performance figure stood out. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than any known aircraft, Allied or Axis. Theoretically, its dense frame and airflow could withstand over 500 miles per hour, far beyond the structural limits of others. It was a margin no one intended to test in combat, until Robert S. Johnson, a quiet Oklahoman with 40 sorties behind him, found himself on the receiving end of 30 Luftwaffe fighters and had no other choice. His plunge through the clouds that June morning would define the aircraft's destiny and prove that the very weight once mocked as suicide was the secret to survival. The P-47 Thunderbolts' road to legend began not in fame but frustration. By the spring of 1943, squadrons stationed in England were still losing men as fast as they arrived. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader wing commanders knew the bomber routes by heart. A stream of B-17s would appear over Calais or Lille at 20,000 feet, too large to miss and too slow to escape. Out of the sun came phalanxes of Bf-109Gs and FW-190As, swooping through the formation, shredding fortresses before dissolving into the clouds. Their agility and shallow dive recovery gave them dominance. The new Thunderbolt units sent to cover those same raids were learning humiliation firsthand. Fuel shortage kept them close to the coast. Radio interference sliced orders into static. When they did make contact with German aircraft, the giant American fighters too often found themselves outturned and outclimbed. Many returned damaged, some never returned at all. At a press briefing in London that February, one RAF officer, asked about America's latest miracle fighter, replied dryly, "It looks as though a farm tractor joined the Air Corps." He wasn't alone in his skepticism, yet the aircraft's architect, Alexander Kartveli, remained calm. He had designed around a single quality the Allies hadn't yet appreciated: raw endurance. The Pratt & Whitney radial engine could take punishment few inline engines survived. Self-sealing tanks reduced fires. Heavy armor panels turned direct cannon hits aside. It wasn't built to dance. It was built to bring its pilot home. Within the 8th Air Force, one commander refused to let the program die, Colonel Hub Zemke. He was 35, analytical, blunt, and carried a notebook of calculations almost as thick as his flight manual. Where others saw flaw, Zemke saw misunderstood design. He reorganized his 56th Fighter Group around one principle: discover what the Thunderbolt could do instead of forcing it to do what it couldn't. He drilled his men on energy fighting. Use altitude as armor, gravity as weapon, and weight as exit strategy. In his words, you climb to strike, you dive to live. The first success came that spring. During a cloudy escort run over the Dutch coast, a flight of P-47s led by Francis Gaby Gabreski caught a formation of FW-190s head-on. Instead of turning with them, Gabreski rolled over, dove straight down, and let the airframe's mass turn speed into momentum. At 430 miles per hour, the German fighters broke away, unable to follow without risking structural failure. Returning to base, Gabreski reported, "She's a rock, but a rock that falls faster than anything with wings." Zemke converted that remark into doctrine. From then on, the Thunderbolt would fight vertically, not horizontally. The boom and zoom era had begun. It was still dangerous. Dive speeds approaching 500 miles per hour created forces no pilot training manual covered. Buffeting and compressibility threatened to lock controls, flatten wings, or worse. Every pilot knew the upper limit existed somewhere below terminal velocity. No one wanted to find it the hard way. One pilot was about to. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, an Oklahoma native barely out of his teens, had flown missions since late 1942. He was methodical, unassuming, and had earned respect by steady performance rather than showmanship. On 26 June 1943, his squadron joined a massive escort for B-24s targeting rail yards in Rouen. German interceptors climbed to meet them before the bombers reached the coast. The sky dissolved into chaos, spinning contrails, black flak blooms, radio shouts muffled by static. Johnson's P-47 took a burst through the wing from a 190's 20mm cannon. Oil pressure dropped. The fuselage filled with smoke. Then a second burst. His canopy jammed from the blast, hydraulic lines gone, left wing peppered with holes. He rolled into a dive to escape, assuming only that death would come quickly. What he didn't know was that the very weight haunting pilot's nightmares was about to become his savior. As his Thunderbolt plummeted toward the channel, gravity and aerodynamics converged. The R-2800 engine, uncowled and gashing air, sustaining thrust through the dive, the big tail stabilizing airflow otherwise fatal. German pursuers watched in disbelief as the American fighter dived past limits that on their gauges would have meant destruction. For minutes it fell, then held together. Out of the storm of sound came something new. Proof that Kartveli's monster couldn't only take hits, it could disappear into the laws of physics the Luftwaffe couldn't follow. That single downward gamble would become airborne scripture for every Thunderbolt pilot who lived to read it. From then onward, flight manuals no longer warned of the dive, they celebrated it. When Republic Aviation's engineers first saw the post-combat analysis of Johnson's dive, they realized that luck had simply exposed what calculation had already predicted, and fear had ignored. The P-47's unique design, with its turbo supercharger tunneled along the fuselage and an 18-cylinder R-2800 driving a massive propeller, had created an aerodynamic quirk that no other fighter shared: stability in chaos. Where streamlined European aircraft sheared their wings beyond 480 miles per hour, the Jug's weight and deep-set tailplanes forced it nose forward through turbulent air, allowing a controlled descent instead of a terminal spin. Engineers studying Johnson's bullet-scarred plane saw metal stretched but intact, airframe bruised yet unbroken. Tests later at Wright Field confirmed the Thunderbolt could endure compressibility forces above 0.74 Mach, unheard of for a piston-engine plane. The jukebox of pipes feeding the turbo supercharger even acted as a structural brace, distributing stress through the body during high-speed dives. Accidental genius turned into doctrine. What looked unsightly was, in fact, survival sculpted from error. For Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, vindication came quietly. Where the Luftwaffe's engineering worshipped form, his philosophy belonged to American industry. Build it sturdy, simplify what matters, accept the rest as weight you can carry. In the air war's brutal mathematics, that weight became the difference between disaster and triumph. The Thunderbolt spoke in multiples of 8. Each wing mounted 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns synchronized to converge 300 yards ahead of the propeller. Pilots had over 3,400 rounds at their fingertips. A 5-second burst meant over 500 bullets tearing forward at nearly 900 meters per second. Where most fighters nicked or slashed an opponent, the Jug erased it. When Johnson pulled out of his dive and later found an FW-190 still on his tail, those 8 guns spat in return. A 2-second squeeze and the German disintegrated mid-turn. Gun camera footage from that flight shows flame blooming in the rain haze, pieces tumbling like black paper. It wasn't marksmanship. It was physics meeting firepower. For the pilots of the 56th Group, heavy armament did more than deliver kills. It defined tactics. Their confidence grew from the knowledge that one straight pass at full burst could destroy any enemy fighter or shred a bomber's formation. Zemke's Wolfpack codified it. Attack from above, single pass, let velocity and 8 barrels do the talking. The Germans called it unfair. Americans called it efficiency. The impossible dive changed not just physics but philosophy. Colonel Hub Zemke reevaluated everything about airfighting. The P-47 could not twist within a Messerschmitt's radius, but it could own the vertical. Altitude became armor. By 1944, the 56th and 4th Fighter Groups used elaborate tiered formations, circling high above bomber streams like hawks watching prey. When Luftwaffe fighters darted upward toward the bombers, Thunderbolts fell upon them from 30,000 feet, firing once, diving through, then climbing again in formation. Zemke drilled his men not to chase but to reset, energy retention as gospel. It was mathematical, almost impersonal warfighting, the beginning of what modern air forces call energy maneuver tactics. And it worked. By the end of 1943, the life expectancy of a German interceptor attacking an Allied bomber formation had dropped to under 9 minutes. The jug's heft turned into instrument precision. Each strike coordinated, each dive a signature move. Luftwaffe aces like Heinz Knoke and Walter Dahl recorded the sensation in their diaries. The sudden roar from above, guns like typewriters hammering the sky, and the heavy silver shapes vanishing into cloud before a response was possible. Every encounter rewrote confidence on one side and despair on the other. No single pilot, not even Johnson, could have transformed air combat alone. A continent did it for him. American factories at Evansville, Farmingdale, and Oklahoma City produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts before the war ended. Many assembled by women who had never driven a car, now riveting the largest fighter in history. Their work turned knowledge into mass, each part interchangeable, each innovation tested at lightning pace. Logistics defined destiny. While Germany rationed aluminium, America shipped it by the trainload. Kartveli's design, heavy by intent, felt reckless only to nations counting ounces. To the United States, abundance made ambition affordable. Pilots like Johnson could hurl themselves through impossible dives because millions of anonymous hands back home guaranteed their replacement parts and fuel. In that alliance between intellect and industry lay the real revolution. A machine that didn't merely fly, it endured. By summer's end, reports from intercepted German cables revealed cautious awe. Enemy radial fighter demonstrates excessive dive speed. Cannot pursue. Recommend avoidance. Avoidance. The word that every pilot dreams to hear from his enemy. The scientific synonym for fear. By late 1943, what had begun as a desperate experiment had matured into a plan of dominance. Johnson's survival, once a curiosity, became a blueprint. Kartveli's monster had revealed its secret. When courage meets engineering patience, even gravity can be tamed. The next year would bring proof at scale, Thunderbolts turning sky into battlefield geometry, leveraging their imperfection into perfection itself. For all its mechanical strength, the Thunderbolt was still only as brave as the men who flew it. No manual taught what happened above 500 miles per hour when instruments blurred, wings screamed, and vision tunneled gray from G-force. Pilots crossed that threshold on instinct alone. Inside the jug, courage was neither loud nor cinematic. It was the quiet bargain between man and metal. I'll trust you if you trust me. Young Americans arrived at airfields across East Anglia with optimism that died by the first briefing. German pilots were veterans. The skies were traps, but they learned the aircraft's temperament through ritual. The slow rumble of the radial engine, the way vibrations smoothed at full power, the deep structural hum before a dive. They joked that each jug had its own personality, some willing, some sullen, but every man respected its blunt honesty. Unlike the delicate Spitfire or Mustang, this plane didn't flatter them. It demanded obedience. When Robert S. Johnson landed his shot-to-pieces aircraft after that June 26th mission, mechanics counted more than 200 holes. He had no elevator cables left, barely partial aileron control, and still the Thunderbolt had carried him safely across the channel. Photographs taken that evening, Johnson dazed beside the shredded fuselage, cigarettes shaking in his fingers, circulated the next day through every American base in Britain. For rookie pilots, it wasn't bravery that inspired them. It was proof that their faith in the machine wasn't misplaced. To the German high command, the P-47's arrival at first meant little. They had faced the Lockheed P-38 and Spitfires before. Both were faster off the line. Both fell easily to the F-190 in sustained turns. But by late 1943, field reports from occupied France grew alarming. Pilots described American fighters starting attacks from unimaginable heights, diving so fast that cannon shells curved away behind them. Intercepts above 25,000 feet turned into suicide missions for the Luftwaffe. Every autumn raid brought fresh losses. Luftwaffe tacticians struggled to translate physics into survival. Some ordered shallower dives. Others insisted their men engage jugs only from head-on. It made little difference. At speeds beyond 480 miles per hour, German aircraft entered compressibility stall. Control surfaces froze, airframes trembled into pieces. The Thunderbolt alone kept its balance. In diaries recovered from shot-down German aces, the tone shifted from arrogance to dread. One wrote, "They fall upon us with the weight of the sky itself." Another scrawled, "Jagdbomber mit Hölle Motor," Fighter with engine from hell. For every P-47 lost, Luftwaffe intelligence counted 4 of their own. It wasn't only a tactical defeat. It was a psychological fracture. The Reich's faith in superior machinery had met its opposite, a plain American brute that survived where artful design collapsed. By January 1944, German briefings officially classified the Thunderbolt as unüberwindlich, unovercome. No finer compliment could have marked its triumph. If one mind turned the jug from curiosity to legend, it was Colonel Hubert Zemke. Tall, exacting, and intolerant of myth, Zemke's leadership reshaped not only how Thunderbolts flew, but how fighter warfare itself would evolve. He understood that technology without tactics is just potential. Zemke codified energy fighting, power, altitude, and patience as weapons, to the point of near religion. Every pilot learned to think in vectors instead of passion, attack from above, use gravity's loan of speed, never linger. Under Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group became notorious, nicknamed Zemke's Wolfpack. They didn't chase glory, they measured efficiency. Kills mattered less than discipline. A Thunderbolt returning home with bullet scars but no funeral flowers meant the doctrine worked. When they flew cover for bombers over Hanover or Bremen, their formation strategies formed invisible architecture in the sky. Columns, pivots, re-entries. Each motion rehearsed until reaction replaced thought. Their kill ratio rose faster than anyone predicted. By mid-1944, the 56th alone earned nearly 700 confirmed victories. Hub Zemke's pilots regarded their aircraft as comrades rather than tools. Mechanics painted names under the cockpit lip: Happy Jack, Fiery Ginger, Ole Miss. Before takeoff, many tapped the cowling with 2 fingers, superstition merging with gratitude. War historians later credited Zemke's approach with conserving lives so effectively that his Wolfpack outlasted nearly every other U.S. fighter group in the theater. Every weapon reflects its maker. The Thunderbolt carried the accent of its country: industrial, informal, massive. It lacked European grace but compensated with democratic accessibility. Ground crews could fix it with hammers. Pilots could abuse it and still land alive. Newspapers at home ran headlines such as, "Fat and fearless of the plane Hitler can't kill." Children in Brooklyn drew squat outlines of the jug on chalkboards, while factories in Michigan raced to produce more, yet inside its shadow existed, detail unseen by propaganda. Pilots worn thin, mechanics sleeping under wings, oil stains on flight jackets, the radio chatter of boys speaking about dinner menus while streaking over flamethrower emplacements. That humanity became the aircraft's heartbeat. When Johnson's story hit the New York Times, letters arrived by the thousands from mothers thanking the man who designed that angel. Kartveli replied privately, "She was not an angel. She was America, loud, oversized, and too difficult to kill." In combining personality and production, the jug bridged a psychological gulf between worlds. It allowed ordinary men to believe they could defy physics, and sometimes they did. The myth of the impossible dive transformed from anecdote into national metaphor. By the dawn of 1944, no one in Allied command questioned the jug's worth. The Luftwaffe's freedom above Western Europe had ended. Factories shifted to produce more P-47s, fitting them for bombs and rockets to hammer the enemy into retreat on the ground. The heavy fighter had eclipsed its critics, and its pilots had come to trust that even the sky could be conquered by persistence. The next test would prove that the impossible dive was only the beginning, the moment when lofty duels turned into a grinding aerial siege that broke the Reich's spine. France, June 26, 1943. The morning air above Rouen was thin and brittle, the kind that turned sunlight into glass. At 20,000 feet, contrails crossed like scars across a pale sky. Below them, 40 B-24 Liberators lumbered eastward, bound for railway yards feeding the German war machine. High above and behind, their shields waited, thunderheads of P-47 Thunderbolts arranged in loose escort formation. Every pilot knew this route by heart, and every man dreaded it. German radar had seen them coming hours ago. The ambush was a certainty, not a question. Within minutes, the certainty arrived. A swarm of Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s and FW-190s, burst through the cirrus haze, cannon fire stitching bright threads through the bomber streams. Early warning vanished in static. Radio channels jammed with shouts, "Bandits, 9 o'clock high!" Flak from Rouen seethed upward. Smoke blooms froze in midair. For Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, tail-end pilot of Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, the sky collapsed into noise. His element leader rolled and vanished into cloud, leaving Johnson suddenly alone. Above him, an FW-190 dived, one of the new A-5 variants armed with twin cannons and outer machine guns. Johnson broke right, feeling rounds slam through his left wing. Metal shrieked. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy. The world spun. He steadied, checked gauges. Nothing but red needles and silence from the radio. As he tried to climb, another burst struck. Bullets perforated engine cowling and fuselage, severed control cables, and jammed the cockpit hood tight against its rails. Fire. Hit again. Oil smeared across glass until the horizon vanished. Every instrument trembled under vibration. The engine coughed once, caught, and surged again as if furious. He was out of options. The canopy wouldn't open. The extinguisher line was dead and oxygen was nearly gone. Johnson felt the jug shudder under him like a living thing. He shoved the stick forward and dove. At first, the dive was reflex, a pilot's final gesture to reach open water before bailing. But as the altimeter reel spun down through 15,000 feet, the impossible began. The cockpit's walls stabilized. The vibration smoothed. Instead of tearing apart as textbooks promised, the jug settled into momentum like a train gripping rails. The airframe trembled but held firm. The heavy tail resisted pitch reversal. Johnson looked out into the slipstream and saw tracer trails missing wide. The Germans followed but soon peeled away, unwilling to chase what physics forbade. Wind roared so loudly it became silence. Johnson realized the machine was diving faster than anything he'd ever felt, perhaps 550 miles per hour. He edged the ailerons, bracing for flutter. They stayed responsive. Oil pressure stabilized. The turbo howl returned beneath the wind's shriek. When he eased back slowly on the stick, the horizon rose. He could feel his own weight multiply, vision dimming to tunnel gray, blood dragging downward. Still, the wings held, bending but refusing to snap. At 4,000 feet, Lucky 7, his Thunderbolt, burst from the low cloud layer into a clean blue patch of morning. Behind, contrails dwindled. Above, only silence. Johnson's dive had erased pursuit. Gravity had become his ally. He leveled out, took one trembling breath, and pointed west toward home. But the test wasn't over. Minutes later, another FW-190 spotted the wounded aircraft. The German closed in efficiently, a marksman finishing a cripple. Johnson felt impacts hammer the rear fuselage, the prop gone ragged. Ammunition feeding into the tail like thunder. He pressed his head against the armor plate, expecting at last to burn. Still the jug roared on. Its radial engine, leaking oil from a dozen holes, refused to quit. A final burst from the Wonder 90 struck across the canopy in sparks. Then incredibly, the German ceased fire. As Johnson watched, the enemy plane slid alongside him. Pilot visible, puzzled, perhaps admiring or bewildered. He raised his hand in salute, rolled, and vanished northward. There is no photograph, only testimony. But every witness who heard the story later agreed. The Luftwaffe had just met the fighter. It could not kill. Johnson crossed the channel alone. Engine sputtering, canopy black with oil. At Manston Airfield, he crash-landed on the grass strip, brakes shredded, propeller bent. Mechanics ran toward the wreck, expecting a corpse. Johnson climbed out unhurt except for burns and disbelief. When they counted the holes, there were 219 through the prop blades, the fuselage nearly transparent with daylight. He sat on the wing, shaking, a cigarette between bloody fingers. A reporter who later saw the scene wrote, "It was as if the airplane itself refused the idea of gravity." In that quiet aftermath, America's heaviest fighter revealed its secret to the men who had doubted it. The impossible dive hadn't destroyed the P-47 Thunderbolt. It had created it. By nightfall, the story traveled faster than gunfire. Across windswept airfields in East Anglia, word spread through canteens and briefing huts. Johnson made it back. Pilots stopped mid-sentence. Mechanics pressed closer around a dented, smoke-blackened P-47 gleaming under hangar floodlights. When they saw the holes, they fell silent. Rivets had been peeled like skin, elevator cables shredded, rudder patched with ripped cloth. The propeller bore 19 cannon strikes, yet had kept turning. It was not a miracle. It was design and defiance fused. Once the official report reached Colonel Hub Zemke, the tone of every tactical order changed. The P-47 was no longer a burden, it was a weapon waiting for faith. Zemke convened his staff in the chilly map room at Halesworth Airfield and dictated the line that would become doctrine. From now on, dive to live. Climb to kill. That was how the legend began, the heaviest U.S. fighter redefined by gravity itself. Within weeks, tests confirmed what Johnson's near-death tumble had implied. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers forced a Thunderbolt prototype into controlled dives exceeding 500 miles per hour. Every aerodynamic law they'd trusted bent slightly, but it didn't break. Compressibility buffeting, the nightmare that ripped wings off Spitfires and Messerschmitts, merely shivered along the Jug's oversized fuselage before smoothing out as control surfaces stiffened. Kartveli's excess metal, so often mocked, was acting as an accidental counterweight, balancing lift loss with raw mass. The dive had turned from liability to armor. Zemke's Wolfpack wasted no time translating science into survival. Their pilots learned to weaponize descent angles. At 25,000 feet, they reversed the rules of pursuit. The advantage belonged to whoever owned the vertical. Instead of turning, they dropped like guillotines, unleashing 8 50 cal machine guns in a single synchronized burst. For German interceptors accustomed to float and weave, the Jug's speed was inhuman. One blink between life and vaporization. Pilots returning from missions over Paris and Rennes reported enemy fighters abandoning attacks the moment Thunderbolts appeared. By autumn 1943, loss ratios spoke louder than any encounter report. Thunderbolt groups, once dismissed as expendable, now returned with less than a 5% casualty rate, the lowest of any Allied fighter in Europe. Where B-17 crews once murmured prayers over radio static, they now settled behind armor glass, knowing a ring of Jug pilots prowled above them, ready to dive into the swarm. Headquarters took notice. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, visited Zemke's field personally, shaking the colonel's hand before cameras. A press officer trailing him asked what made the P-47 different. Eaker's answer, printed in stars and stripes, was succinct: heavier by heaven, stronger by hell. It became the unspoken slogan of every Thunderbolt crew chief from Norfolk to Naples. The Luftwaffe felt the change almost immediately. Their own pilots began suffering fatal structural failures trying to chase the Jugs through dives. Debriefings described control locks, wings buckling, instruments freezing solid around 480 Mach, while the enemy thundered ahead untouched. German engineers attempted hasty fixes, stiffer wing spars, new dive brakes, but supply starvation and fuel cuts made experimentation lethal. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was losing experts faster than it could train replacements. They could fight the Allies. They could not fight physics. For Johnson, the man who had unwillingly triggered the revolution, recognition came reluctantly. His commander recommended the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest U.S. award for valor. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and clarity of spirit while facing beyond certain destruction." Johnson accepted it quietly, more grateful for the patched-up Thunderbolt waiting outside the ceremony tent. He flew the same aircraft again weeks later. Engine oil still burned into the paint. Mechanics had stenciled a new message beneath the canopy in small block letters: "Nothing can kill this ship." He laughed, saluted, and took off into a gray coastal sky. By spring 1944, the impossible dive had matured from single story to operational strategy. Every training syllabus in the newly formed 9th Air Force included a module copied from Zemke's debrief: energy advantage and gravity recovery. It was the birth of the modern energy maneuver system, later used by jet pilots for decades. In classrooms from California to Cornwall, instructors replayed gun camera films from Johnson's mission frame by frame, pointing to the moment when smoke trails bent and physics changed sides. Each viewing ended the same way: silence, then applause. Unlikely as it seemed, one anonymous pilot's fall through the clouds had altered the course of aerial warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born too heavy, too late, too slow, had turned the laws of weight into weapons. From that day, it ceased being called the Jug as insult. It became the shield and sword of the western sky. When the next generation of U.S. fighters, The Mustang, the Hellcat, the Corsair, claimed the headlines. Their engineers admitted quietly that every blueprint carried echoes of the P-47's black oil heroism, because somewhere over Rouen, in that 7-minute fall between certainty and physics, America's air war learned a new rule. Sometimes the fastest climb begins with a dive. And from that dive, the Thunderbolt rose into legend. By the summer of 1944, the sound of a P-47's radial engine had become the unofficial anthem of Allied air power. It was not elegant, but it was unmistakable. Deep, guttural, more industrial than musical. Under that noise, an empire of steel turned to dust. The Luftwaffe's once disciplined fighter arm was disintegrating. Attrition, fuel starvation, and a steady drain of veteran pilots left them with dwindling squadrons, scrambling to defend a bleeding Reich. Every new Thunderbolt sortie over France announced Allied inevitability. Factories burning, train lines ripped open, tanks reduced to torches in their tracks. The aircraft born to escort bombers now owned the ground itself. After Normandy, earth and sky melted into one theater. Thunderbolts strafed troop convoys on the road to Caen, pulverized bridges at Argenton, smashed bunkers at Mortagne. When Patton's Third Army punched east across France, P-47s rode shotgun, swarming over retreating German columns in continuous rotation. Pilots called it train busting, or more grimly, the harvest. Each success was traced back to that one discovery almost a year earlier, the plane's ability to trust its own fall. Without that dive, the Thunderbolt would never have dominated low-level attack. The same rugged wings that held together at 500 miles allowed violent pullouts just above treetop. Mechanics welded extra bomb racks under those wings. Ground crews stocked 500-pounders and clusters of rockets. The lumbering high-altitude escort had been sculpted, almost by accident, into history's first true fighter bomber. By the time Allied troops crossed the Seine, Johnson's impossible dive had grown into an entire doctrine. Reports from 9th Air Force headquarters in August 1944 listed nearly 6,000 sorties a week, flown by Thunderbolts alone, more than all other American fighters combined. General Quesada, the air chief supporting the Normandy front, put it bluntly, "The jug won't dance, but it will stomp the enemy flat." In Belgium and the Ardennes forests, civilians learned the rhythm of that stomping. When they heard the rumble of radial engines and saw silver silhouettes diving through clouds, they ran toward cellars not out of fear but out of faith. It meant Allied armies were near. German soldiers, by contrast, dropped their rifles and bolted for the trees. Captured diaries from autumn 1944 are full of a single word scrawled in pencil: Thunderbolts. As if no translation were needed. Back in England, production lines couldn't keep pace. Republic Aviation's Long Island plant glowed pink at night, from the reflection of molten aluminium poured into wing molds. The workers, mostly women in coveralls, hair wrapped in scarves, signed each completed fuselage before shipping, sometimes scribbling small notes on the hidden frames. "Come home safe, boys." For many pilots, those messages survived shrapnel when nothing else did. Their comfort weighed less than a gram, yet outlasted a war. The Allied bomber offensive, once unsustainable, was now emboldened. Every mission leaving British soil knew the Thunderbolts would be waiting, weaving lazy arcs around the big fortresses. To the bomber crews, the squat egg-shaped fighters were not ugly anymore. They were angels carved from scrap iron. One top turret gunner wrote home that when a jug appeared outside his window, it looked as if God had parked a tank in the clouds. By early 1945, the legend had crossed oceans. In the Pacific, the new P-47N variant, extended wing and long-ranged, was flying off coral runways, escorting B-29s toward Japan. The dive that saved Johnson now saved crews from flak traps above Formosa. It was proof that lessons learned over Normandy hedgerows could live again over tropical reefs. When Hitler's Germany collapsed that May, Thunderbolts still roared overhead, not because they were needed, but because silence felt wrong after so much motion. The airmen landed to a world that had changed shape beneath them. They walked away from their aircraft and, without ceremony, left behind machines that had defied both physics and prediction. Historians would later call it evolution through endurance, a species of fighter born in doubt, surviving by gravity, crowned by necessity. But to those who saw its shadow over occupied Europe, it was simpler. It was the sound of deliverance on wings that refused to break. Peace crept back into the skies with unfamiliar quiet. The whine of turbines belongs to jet-age memory. But in 1945, the last thing Europe heard before silence was the same thunder that had once terrified it. The rolling boom of radial engines returning from victory. On forward fields from Reims to Frankfurt, P-47s stood wingtip to wingtip, their bellies caked with mud, their paint singed from near misses. For 6 years the world had lived under ignition. Now the pilots unpacked duffels, wrote letters, and listened to engines tick cool in the evening haze. The statistics seemed unreal. Of more than 15,500 Thunderbolts built, barely 1 in 8 had been lost in combat, a ratio unmatched by any frontline Allied fighter. Yet for every machine retired, a generation of aviators remained scarred by what they had done and what had been done to them. Quietly, engineers, mechanics, and survivors turned lessons from the battlefield into blueprints for the future. The next designs on their drafting tables, the F-84 Thunderjet and later the A-10 Thunderbolt II, carried more than the name. They carried the unspoken truth discovered in 1943, that strength itself could be aerodynamic if shaped with patience. To historians, the P-47's triumph was never simply a technical story. It was cultural. Where Nazi Germany exalted precision and fragility, the Thunderbolt embodied messy endurance. It accepted dents and kept flying, accepted smoke and kept breathing. In its curves lived a particular idea of democracy. That design did not require perfection to serve courage. Every bullet hole patched by a mechanic on a rain-soaked airstrip was another vote of confidence in that idea. Even the young captains who mourned the lost elegance of the Spitfire eventually admitted that ugliness had its grace. When journalists visited Republic Aviation's Long Island plant after VE Day, Alexander Kartveli stood among unfinished fuselages that would never fly. Reporters wanted drama. He offered understatement. "I built her too big," he said, "and some mornings I am glad of it." Nearby, a row of women who had riveted those same panels during war production kept photo clippings of Thunderbolts on bulletin boards, black and white proof that their hands had shaped a machine, capable of saving men they would never meet. Across the Atlantic, Luftwaffe veterans confronted a reckoning of their own. Captured German pilots at interrogation centers were asked which Allied fighter they most respected. More than half named the P-47. Some cited its weapons, others its ability to absorb punishment and still attack. A few answered simply, "It frightened us." The admission was important. Superiority in design had been Germany's self-portrait. The P-47 had destroyed that illusion not by art, but by refusal to quit. By 1946, surplus Thunderbolts were being sold for scrap at pennies a pound. Rows of them, wings removed, lay in long metallic fields. Children in nearby towns climbed on them as playgrounds. Pilots turned away, unable to watch indifference erase what had been salvation. Yet somehow a handful survived. Smaller nations, Italy, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey, bought them as guardians for newborn air forces. The same aircraft that once shattered Germany's railways now flew peace patrols over tropical coasts. The Jug thundered on, its second life quieter but equally improbable. Back home, demobilized flyers found that civilian silence unnerved them. Some studied engineering, some drove tractors, a few joined air shows where they could still yank that big yoke and feel a machine trust them again. The notion that a dive could be both surrender and victory followed them everywhere. They had learned, like their aircraft, to turn falling into flight. Time reduced the legend to museum pieces. Yet every time a surviving Thunderbolt fires up on a July airshow morning, veterans and grandchildren alike lift their eyes to the heavy plane carving a slow arc overhead. The crowd always reacts the same way. First laughter at its bulk, then awe at its sound. When the prop bite deepens into that old industrial roar, conversations stop. It is the voice of iron philosophy, that greater weight, when harnessed by courage, becomes freedom. The pilot who proved it, Robert S. Johnson, died decades later in peacetime, his metals polished dull with age. But the sky has long memory. Every survivor still flying beneath that endless blue owes something to the morning. He fell faster than fear, and rose as the man who taught gravity respect. History remembers glory in motion, the flash of engines, the roar of victory, but it's the silence afterward that holds meaning. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt never sang like the Spitfire, never danced like the Mustang. It thundered, labored, endured. And through that endurance, it rewrote what flight itself could mean. The juggernaut that engineers thought too heavy had proved that survival is sometimes the highest form of performance. The pilot who dove toward certain death found in that fall a truth that every generation of aviators would inherit, that bravery and design are partners. One dares, the other endures. Together they transformed disaster into doctrine. After Rouen, gravity was no longer a threat. It was a tool. Johnson's impossible dive didn't just save one man. It opened a corridor through physics and fear that others would follow for decades. In an era when skies were ruled by delicate grace, the Thunderbolt's brutish lines spoke a new language, one of pragmatism, patience, and the will to outlast. It became the sound of factories, sweat, and immigrant minds inventing freedom with wrenches. Every rivet that held through anti-aircraft fire was proof that ordinary people, united by effort, could build something stronger than terror. Even its imperfections became virtues. They reminded us that strength, to be real, must carry its weight. Today, when one of the few surviving jugs rumbles to life and climbs heavily into an airshow sky, that old rhythm returns, smoke, thunder, and the echo of a forgotten faith. It is more than nostalgia. It is a living heartbeat of ingenuity, reminding us that courage is not the absence of fear or weight, but the mastery of both. The Thunderbolt story is not about speed or beauty, but belief. Belief that what was once dismissed as impossible could ascend, survive, and protect every dream born beneath its wings. If this story moved you, like this video to honor the spirit of those who flew when the odds said they couldn't. Subscribe for more true and untold stories of World War II brought back to life through history's lens. Comment below with your thoughts or the forgotten hero you'd like us to uncover next. We read them all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.